لا إله إلا الله. Okay, good morning, everyone. So today we are going to start our class, the first class, English literature in the 20th century. But before that, let me talk about, the class and its time. As we discussed on the group, many students could not, agree on a specific time. Some of you want it on the time of the class. Some want to change the time. So I said it's better to just record the class and put it on e-learning and Facebook, so you can access the class whenever you want. And that's the best way, to communicate with you. Anyways, so let's get started. Literature in the 20th century. So today we are going to talk about the following, okay? First of all, we are going to recognize the characteristics of modernism in literature, define postcolonial literature, describe postmodern literature, and assess the role of English as a global language in the 20th century and early 21st century. All right, so these are some of the learning objectives that we are going to discuss today. First of all, the Edwardian age. The death of Queen Victoria in 1901 and the accession of the Edward VI inaugurated not only a new century, but a new milieu in art, an extension and development of the aestheticism that characterized the last decade of the 19th century. The Edwardian age and the modern period, which followed roughly from 1910 through the end of the Second World War, differed sharply from the preceding age. So the Edwardian age, as you can see here, is different from the Victorian age. You remember in the 19th century, we discussed the Victorian age. Why we call it the Victorian age? Simply because Queen Victoria was the Queen of England. But now at the early 20th century, 1901, Queen Victoria died, and then we have King Edward became the King of England, and that's why it is called the Edwardian age. Okay, so the elegance and extravagance of the aristocracy led King Edward to continue unchecked until World War I. However, underneath the ostentation so loved by the king sounded ominous warnings of unrest through Britain and the European continent. At the death of Edward in 1910, the British Empire also was dying as an imperialism and came under increasing criticism. So here, this is very important because England was a very great empire, but now this empire came to, it was described as a dying empire here. It was described as a dying empire. Okay, events such as the Boer War exposed the consequences of empire building, and authors such as Joseph Conrad vividly portrayed the British public a picture contrasting the supposed glory of empire. Even Edward VII himself criticized the British presence in India and the treatment of the country's inhabitants. So this simply means that England was an empire. And in the 19th century, England was depicted as a flourishing country that has different, colonies in different parts of the world. But in the 20th century, this image, the beautiful image of the English empire or the British empire, collapsed. And the result is that many writers try to portray the empire negatively as we can see here by Joseph Conrad here. He vividly portrayed for the British a public picture contrasting the supposed glory of the empire. So instead of the empire being glorious, the empire is depicted negatively here. Okay, so the next page, poets such as Thomas Hardy often referred to as the great pessimist, depicted the new country as a time of uncertainty and disbelief, both in God and integrity of humankind. And this is also a very important thing about the 20th century period, is that the age was characterized by uncertainty and disbelief, both in God in time of integrity of humankind. So these are, important things that you have to take in mind. Cynicism, pessimism replaced Victorian optimism and confidence. So in the previous age, if you compare the 19th century with the 20th century, in the previous age, there are two words that are very important. First is optimism, second, confidence. And I can add another word, which is progress. Now, optimism, because in the Victorian age, they believe in progress, that the future will be bright, the future will be beautiful, the future will bring us something positive, and we are confident about this. But in the 20th century, this concept of optimism and confidence was replaced by the sense of cynicism and pessimism. Cynicism and pessimism means that the people doubt the future. The people do not trust the future, and that the future is not as the Victorians tried to depict positively. In fact, the future is something scary, something that is pessimistic and crazy. Although science and technology continued their ever more rapid advancement with electricity, telegraph, and radio, continued to machinization in workplaces, automobiles, and airplanes, society seemed to lack a solid center of reference, a core belief that held the uncertainty of life in check and gave life a sense of purpose and direction. So simply here, what is going on is that, the rapid advancement in technology, in electricity, telegraph, radio, and all these kinds of inventions led to a lack of solid center of reference, meaning that people at that time disbelieve in everything. They disbelieve in religion, in culture, in society. They don't trust any, they don't trust anything. They become disbelievers. And that's why there is no a solid center that they can depend on. Joseph Conrad and Thomas Hardy bridge the 19th and 20th century both in time and the philosophy of their writing. By the way, here these are the two poets that we mentioned before, which are Thomas Hardy and Joseph Conrad. These are, the writers that we can call the bridgers, who bridge between the 19th and 20th century, because they have some characteristics of the 19th century, but at the same time, they, include in their work, some topics that have to do with the 20th century, such as cynicism, pessimism, uncertainty, and lack of trust in any solid reference or solid center, as mentioned before. Okay. Now, the first thing that we have to look at is the modern age. The modern age. The modern age here, the modern age, King George IV followed his father Edward VII to the throne in 1910 and reigned until 1936. Only 4 years after he became king, George IV led his country through World War I, fighting against his first cousin, Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany, both men descendants of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert. Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, overthrown and unexpected with his wife and family in 1917, was also King George's cousins by marriage, and his wife Alexandra, another descendant of Victoria and Albert, whose children had married into most of the royal families in Europe. Essentially, an entire generation of British men and many women were killed in the First World War, or World War I. Okay. Now here, this is very important. The World War I or sometimes they described it as the Great War. They described it as the Great War. Here, I'm going to write it here. The Great War. Why they described it as the Great War? Because simply this is the first, war that included a huge death of many people. The death of huge people. Others returned, others returned maimed and physically, mentally. And war poets such as Saint Frederick Sassoon and Wilfred Owen, these are called war poets, vividly depict the horror of war, the reality of war, as compared to the slogan and imagined glory of fighting for one's country. The economic cost of the war also devastated Britain. The conspicuous wealth of the Edwardian era disappeared into a financial depression. So here simply the First World War, or the Great War, resulted in the huge number of deaths. More than 20 million people were killed, either soldiers or civilians, including men and women. And the result is that, that England before the war was very rich country because of their, because of the industry, because of the Industrial Revolution, and because they were, they were imperialists. They have their own colonies, and they have their own, wealth. But because of the First World War, this led to economic depression because many people, were killed during the war. And we have two poets, Sage Fred Sassoon and Wilfred Owen, who depicted the horror of the war. So how crazy the war is. And we will discuss these poets, by the way. They were called the war poets. War poets. Okay. And then we have the Irish nationalism. The Irish nationalism brought added tension to Britain, the desire for home rule in England, then part of the British Empire, culminating in the Easter Uprising of the 1916, caused strife and instability on another front for Britain. Fear that Ireland would collaborate with Germany in World War I led to let me go to the next page. Led to the British concessions, and after the war, the granting of the Irish independence in 1922. William Butler Yeats commemorated and contributed to the Irish patriotism in his writing. Now, what is important here that should be highlighted is that now England, during the First World War, they have a problem not only because of the war itself, but also because Ireland want its own independence. And that's why, England has two, fronts and two enemies. The first enemy is the Germans, or or the countries that fight in the First World War. And the second enemy is the Irish people who want to get their freedom and get independence from the British Empire. And one of the famous writers who represent the Irish, independence is called William Butler Yeats, who commemorated and celebrated the Irish patriotism in his writing. The active role of women in the war effort helped achieve universal suffrage in 1928. And this is very important also because in 1928, women were able to get the right to vote. So suffrage here refers to voting. And so they are allowed to vote in 1928. By the end of World War I, Britain was a much different place from the exuberant, confident empire that Victoria knew. So, and here we have England has a huge transformation from being a confident, strong, and optimistic empire to a pessimistic, uncertain, and largely devastated by the First World War. Okay. Um, Now, after the First World War, we have another event that should be highlighted, which is the Second World War. Now, the Second World War is very important because uh, from 18, let me show you here in the text. Now, here, okay, here, okay, from 1814 to 1818, the First World War took place. Okay, but in 1941 to 1946, the Second World War took place. So from 1918, okay, that's like 23 years. Within 23 years, you know, we have another great war, another huge war, another destructive war, which is called the Second World War. So we have the First World War, and then we have the Second World War. And what happened in the Second World War? Here, uh, okay, let me see. We have the oldest son of George the Fourth, Edward, and his role of a Prince of Wales, and their apparent was not was and their heir apparent was not allowed to participate in combat during World War I. But his efforts to visit and encourage areas suffering from depressed economic times in the 1930s made him a popular figure among the British. After the death of his father, Edward became king. However, within a year, he made the government aware that he wished to marry the twice divorced American woman, Wallis Simpson. Because of the monarch's role as head of the Church of England, political leaders and advisors in Britain opposed the marriage. Edward chose to abdicate the throne in order to marry Simpson. Upon his abdication, his younger brother became King George the Fifth, with his wife and queen, Lady Elizabeth Boleyn, and George the Fifth symbolized the courage, fortitude, and the stiffer upper lip with which the country endured the hardship of the Second World War. The couple and their children, the current Queen Elizabeth II and her younger sister, the late Prince Margaret, spent the war years at Buckingham Palace and in Windsor, rather than evacuate to safer areas. The royal family's determination to share in the hardship and danger of the war earned the admiration of the British people. And here they talk about how the Second World War, affected England, and how the monarchy at that time, King George and his wife, were very courageous people. They did not leave England. They did not go to a safe place, but they stay in their palace, Buckingham, defying the enemies and staying in their palace. And this, give them the admiration of the British people, which is very interesting, I think. Um, Thomas Hardy, now modern literature. Thomas Hardy's novel, The Test of the Berville, I think I pronounced it correctly. The ill-fated girl Tessie has conversation with her brother in which he remembers that she has told him the stars are other worlds. When he asks if all the stars' worlds are like their worlds, Tessie replies that the worlds are like the apples on their trees, some splendid and sound, and a few blighted. When he asks which they live on, and a splendid one or a blighted one, Tessie replies, a blighted one. Now here, this is very important because it shows how the world at the beginning of the 20th century is described as a blighted. Now, what does blighted mean? If you go to one of the, okay, just give me a second. If you go to the dictionary and write blight, blight means, you live in a very difficult situation, okay? very difficult situation. So blighted here, as you can see, it's something that is negative, something that is not, welcome. Okay, so that's what they mean by blighted. So blighted here is something negative. So the world in the 20th century is so negative compared to the 19th century, when the world is presented as positive. Okay, modernism in literature. Modernism in literature, approximately from 1910 to 1945, is characterized by a feeling of loss of any centering, destabilizing factor in life, a break with the tradition, and a reaction against established society, religion, and politics. And as I said before, modernist literature is characterized by a feeling of loss of any centering. It means that they reject and they were against or break against the tradition, reaction against society, religion, politics, etc. All these, traditional stuff, they were against it. So in modernist literature, we will see criticism against society, tradition, religion, politics, society. All these things were criticized by modernists. Modernism also see humankind as lacking free will. So unlike the romantics who show the humans as having a free will, in the modern time or the modernist literature, in the 20th century literature, they believe that the human does not have the will. What controls us is not us. We don't control ourselves, but what controls us is the environment that we are placed in. So instead, individuals are victims of circumstances or environment in which they find themselves victim of the environment, much like the animals. So simply, we live in a jungle or a forest, and the way life treats us is by chance. So it's the chance and the environment that determines us, and we don't have a free will. In addition, God, if there is God, is detached from human affairs. Here, so this is a kind of reference to the disbelief in God. So in the 20th century, they don't believe in God. In fact, they said God is dead. They declare the death of God. A divine power may have set the world in motion, but the world now runs according to natural laws without divine intervention. Writers such as T.S. Eliot, James Joyce, and Virginia Woolf, these are some modernist writers, experimented with new forms of literature and new subject matters which explored and depicted modernism as if it affected individual lives. And here is very important because it refers to the idea that literature, has new forms and new subjects. New forms because they try to change the Victorian literature by finding new ways of expression. So there is an experimentation in literature, and there is also new forms in literature and subject and form. And by the way, the best word that describes the 20th century here is the word new. The new age, the new literature, the new forms, the new subject. The word new is very important here. Okay, so many novels attempt to present the reality of the mind, not of the external world. In fact, the narrative tends to reflect what modern writers felt as a lack of order and reason in the world. Novelists such as Virginia Woolf and James Joyce use the stream of consciousness, and this is a very important term. You have to read about it. It's a technique, a narrative style, which attempt to reproduce random thoughts, pattern of human mind affected by external stimuli and mental associations. So this stream of consciousness refers to the idea that that the narrative style in fiction or in the novel depicts or mirror the way we think. So when you read a novel, you feel like you are reading someone thinking. So, and here it's a continuation for the definition. The narrative technique tends to ignore conventions of punctuation and mechanics, much as they do not figure in one's thoughts. So simply here, when we are thinking, we don't have punctuation marks in our heads, right? So the way you think, you write it in a novel. So when we read their novels, we'll find people thinking. And when you think, you don't punctuate your sentences. You don't care about the punctuation and the mechanics. And that's the way they write their literature, sentences that show the way people think and the way people, think about things. Okay, so this is stream of consciousness. That is the first thing. Second thing is imagism, and this is very popular in poetry. Imagism in poetry. In the early 20th century movement in poetry favors clear visual pictures painted with concrete, concise examples. So imagism is taken from the word image. And they believe that poetry should have or favor a clear visual picture painted with concrete, concise language. So simply, you create an image without any accessories, without any extra words that do not help the meaning. So it's an image, not just, having many words and many expressions. Imagism promotes the use of hard images, sparse but specific language, irregular meters. The images spurred a new interest in the 17th century metaphysical poets and their metaphysical conceits. So here, what they are referring to is that when you look at the imagism poetry, you don't find, a regular poem, but what you are looking at is are images created by words. So words create images. So the language has to be very spare and specific. Spare means that don't add any word that is not necessary and that does not help the meaning. And they don't care about the meter, the rhyme and rhythm of the 19th century. So simply they write images regardless of the structure or the form of the poem. That's called imagism. So they create an image of something through words. Okay. In the early 20th century, drama reflects all characters. So we talk about fiction and the stream of consciousness, poetry, imagism. Now here we have a drama reflect all characteristics that permeate the time period. One of these, things about drama is something called the alienating effects of technology, the loss of faith in traditional values, the feeling of the purposefulness of life, so that we live a life that does not have a purpose. And that's why, they disbelieve in God, because they believe that life does not have a purpose. The dramatists often attempt to shock and challenge audience. Experiments in staging and stagecraft parallels experiments in other genres. So the word experiments here, is very important and all the time repeats in the 20th century literature. They always experiments in fiction, in poetry, and even in drama. Now, the experimentation in drama here, leading 20th century dramatists, including the Nobel Prize Harold Pinter, has played The Dumber Water, belonged to the theater of absurd. And here we have a definition of the theater of absurd. Now, if you look at the page, wait, just give me a second. Here, number 3, we have the theater of absurd, a type of drama intended to show the lack of meaning in modern life by depicting characteristics in senseless, hopeless situations, speaking, confusion, sometimes nonsensical dialogue. Here you have to, memorize this because this is very important. And this is the definition of the theater of absurd. And here, this is the definition of imagism. And here, the definition of stream of consciousness. These are the 3 terms, one in fiction, the other in poetry, and this is in drama, the theater of absurd, and its characteristics of the 20th century drama. So the characteristic of the 20th century drama, as I said, the alienating effect of technology, the loss of faith in traditional values, and the feeling of purposefulness of life. Now we go to page 6. Wait. Page 6. Yeah, so page 5. The theater of absurd, and here we have explanation of it. a type of drama intended to show the lack of meaning in modern life by depicting characters in senseless, hopeless situations, speaking confusing, sometimes nonsensical dialogue, with its portrayal of an individual's lack of control over life and the impossibility of communication among human beings and social inequality. So here, the theater of absurd refers to the idea that life is meaningless, senseless, and hopeless. That's life. Second, it refers to the idea that our language is nonsensical, and that's why we have a problem in communication. If we don't have a problem with communication, then we will not have wars, right? Because we have a problem in communication, that's why we don't understand ourselves, and that's why we have wars. So the impossibility of communication is a key sentence here among human beings. And I think if we have time, we will have some, a bit of taste for the theater of absurd if we have time, inshallah. Like, next, here, the new Elizabethan age and the post-colonial literature. Under the death of King George, the sixth, in 1952, Elizabeth acceded to the throne as a Queen Elizabeth II, and her realm, however, looked quite different from that of her great-grandmother, Queen Victoria, who died only 51 years earlier. By the end of the World Wars, the British Empire no longer existed, replaced by the British Commonwealth. Countries that had been British colonies had over time became independent nations. Many of those remaining colonies in the 20th century were granted their independence, but remain dominions rather than colonies of Britain. So here, the transformation during the Elizabethan age, the transformation from the colonial England to the post-colonial, or after the colonization. So simply, England is no longer a colonizing country. It becomes just, a country like other countries, because many countries got their independence in the 1910 and 1920s, like India, all Indian parts, Pakistan, Afghanistan, many Arab countries such as, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, all these countries got their independence from the British Empire. And so we have something new that emerged, which is called the post-colonial literature. What is post-colonial literature? Post-colonial literature, here we have the word post. Post means after colonial. So after the end of the British colonization. Generally refers to literature written in the English language by residents of former British colonies. The subject matter of post-colonial literature typically addresses the oppression and exploitation addresses the oppression and exploitation of colonialism and the attempt to establish national identity after independence and the effect of colonialism after the aftermath of the individual. Okay, and here that's the definition of post-colonial literature. Among the questions raised about post-colonial literature is its place in the studies of British literature. Does post-colonial literature belong to the category of British literature because the country of origin formerly belonged to the British Empire, or does the literature belong to the nationality which produced it? When the term English literature is used to designate literature written in the English language rather than the English written in England or by English citizens, certainly post-colonial literature belongs in English literature studies, as well with American literature, Australian literature, and the literatures of any other English-speaking countries. Some scholars therefore prefer the terminology word literature in English to the word post-colonial that may for some perpetuate the paradigm of imperialists and their occupied victims. The term emphasizes the global view of many scholars, considering important characteristic as well as the prime achievement of this literature. However, such an approach calls into question the inclusion in the British literature studies of some writers traditionally considered British, such as Irish writers James Joyce and William Butler Yeats, both born in Ireland, while it was part of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, but both advocates of the Irish independence. Okay, so let me explain this, what they mean here. Now, what they mean by post-colonial literature here is that post-colonial literature refers to the literature produced in the colonies of the United Kingdoms. After these colonies became independent countries, okay, now the literature produced in these countries or in these colonies are called post-colonial literature. Why is post-colonial literature? Because it is written in English and it is produced in the colonies, you know, controlled by England. But this term post-colonial is very bad. Why? Because it reminds people of the oppression of the United Kingdom. And that's why they try to use the term world literature in English. World literature in English, any literature written in English can be referred to as world literature in English. Okay, I think I feel tired now and I don't know if I will be able to continue, but I think this is enough for today. So next time we will continue our discussion of modernism, inshallah. So this will be for our next time class. And oh, that's the last thing, by the way. How about we are almost done. How about we finish modernism and then, because we don't have, this is page 8. Yeah, well, I think we are done. Let me finish it. And then we will see if we have other things to discuss. So postmodernism. Okay. In his glossary of literary terms, Dr. Kip Wheeler of Carson Newman College characterized postmodernism as, and this is the definition of postmodernism, so you have to know this. It is, while modernism mourned the passing of the unified cultural tradition and wept for its demise in the ruined deep of civilization, so to speak, postmodernism tend to dance in the ruins and plays with the fragments. Okay, so here simply, postmodernism, as we said before, it is a kind of mourning. Mourning means that crying on the passing or the death of a unified culture. So modernism believed that culture is dead and there is no culture or tradition, okay? And they weep for the demise of the unified heap of civilization. They were very sad about the death or the end of the civilization because of the First World War and the Second World War. All these wars destroy the civilization built, you know, for hundreds or thousands years ago. Now, what is postmodernism? It's a movement that comes after modernism, because post means after, and it talks about, you know, the trends or the tense for dancing in the ruins and plays with fragments. Means that it dances. It means that, you know, it not only cries, but it makes fun of the destruction or the death of the cultural traditions. So it doesn't cry like modernism, but it makes fun of postmodernism. Okay, a search for definition of postmodernism leads many to the conclusion that, and here's that's the best, some of the best definitions. There is no definition, specific definition for postmodernism. Some of proffered description of postmodernism negate the possibility of definition by explaining that postmodernism pushes an extreme, the modernist idea that the life and the thought have no central core of reality or meaning. So simply, postmodernism, some people define it as a reaction or a rejection for modernism. Some people believe that postmodernism is not a reaction, but a continuation for modernism. So in this case, there is no specific definition of modernism, but what we have in postmodernism is that they try to push, and here, look at the word push, they try to push to an extreme the modernist idea that life and thought have no central core of reality or meaning. Because if you remember before, when we discussed modernism, we said that for them, life is meaningless and senseless and hopeless. Life does not have meaning. So they try to push this idea to the extreme. Push this idea to an extreme. Epistemological becomes epistemology becomes reliant on the individual mind, and the plurality of epistemologies is considered not only possible but desirable. Only cultural construct provide what is accepted as reality or truth. So here, this is not important. You don't need to, just forget it. I don't think you will be able to understand it because somehow a bit difficult. Postmodernism may be placed in time, the year following the World War II to the last decade of the 20th century. And this is the time when postmodernism started. Postmodernism started from following the World War II, from World War II to the last decade of the 20th century. Okay, now compared with modernism here, I will show you the year. Just give me a second. Okay. Okay, it looks like it doesn't work. But anyways, modernism starts from the early 20th century up until the Second World War, which is in 1945. And after the Second World War, this is the age of postmodernism. From the Second World War, 1948, up until the end of the 20th century, that's the period that we call the postmodern age. During the 1990s and early 20th century, scholars began to speak of being a postmodern era. And this is funny. Not only postmodern, but postmodern. See, that's postmodern. And then we have postmodern era. So postmodern literature, and this is an interesting thing, exhibits some of the same traits as modern literature, but pushes these traits to extreme beyond those of the modern era. And this is, I think we mentioned it before, to push something to extreme beyond those of the modern era. For example, modernists attempt to reproduce the way the human mind works with a stream of consciousness techniques, lead postmodernism, mixing of points of view and deliberate playing with chronology, often for the purpose of questioning realism ontology. Harold Pinter's use of reverse chronology in his 1978 play Betrayal, for example, exemplify postmodern manipulation of time. In a postmodern world, realism and the possibility of absolute truth, moral truth, and empirical truth do not exist. 100, so, and that's in postmodern world, you know, there is no such a thing as truth. There is no such a thing as truth. Truth is something fake, something that we create, but there is no such thing as truth, the absolute truth. So there's no moral truth, there's no empirical truth, there's no absolute truth. All these truths in the postmodern world are groundless and can be rejected and refuted. 100 years after the Victorian grappled with faith, doubt, conflict, the postmodern world embraced nihilism, or nihilism, sometimes they call it. What is nihilism here? Here's the definition is in the footnote here. A philosophy which denies the existence of an objective noble reality, an intrinsic meaning of life, and absolute moral value. And so a philosophy which denies the existence of objective reality, intrinsic meaning of life, and absolute moral value in reality and morality. So simply the nihilism or nihilism, they try to reject every existence of objective reality. There is no such a thing as objective reality. There is no such a thing as truth. Everything is subjective, not objective. Everything is created by us. And if it is created by us, then it's not true, according to the postmodern ideas. As a means of exploring the contrast of reality, postmodernism employs metafiction. Now, look, if you remember, in the modernism, we talked about what? We talked about stream of consciousness, we talked about imagism, we talked about theater of absurd and the alienation effects. These in modernism. Now, in postmodernism, we have nihilism and we have metafiction, which is about fiction about the process of creating fiction. A literary work in which both the author and the reader are conscious of the artifacts as the creation of the author's minds and mirror the process of the mind of creating reality. So simply, it's a metafiction. It's not about the fiction itself, but the process of creating that fiction. What is the stage or the process that include the creation of that fiction? So it's the process, not the fiction itself, which is called metafiction. Okay, and lastly, postmodernism, although many scholars, postmodernism, this is after postmodernism, postmodernism, okay? And this is like, I think it's in our age now, the 21st century. Although many scholars would agree that arts, including literature, have moved beyond postmodernism, there is no agreement on a description or characteristics of the current era. Most agreeing that the history will make those determinations. So simply no one agrees on our era now, that the time that we are living on. It's called postmodern, which is very, strange to find a definition. Okay, I think that's enough for today. Here you will find some key takeaways. This is like, a kind of a summary for what we have discussed today. Let me just conclude in 2-3 minutes. First of all, we talked about the shift from 19th century to 20th century. We talked about the end of the British Empire and that the England or the UK, transformed its position from being an empire to being a country with colonies that became countries, because the British colonies became countries and they became independent. And we talked about the two major events, the First World War and the Second World War, and how these wars, affected the way people think, because people at that time, after the First and the Second World War, they rejected the tradition, they rejected the culture, they rejected the religion, they rejected morality. So they rejected all kinds of foundations and all kinds of truth and power. And we have three major, genres in the 20th century. We have fiction, and the main technique was stream of consciousness. We have drama. The main technique is the theater of absurd and the alienating effect. And the last one is poetry, and the emphasis was on imagism and the metaphysical poetry. So these are some of the main things that we mentioned about modernism. And then the next one is postmodernism. Postmodernism, was something that is similar to modernism, but in a funny way. So simply, instead of taking their literature seriously, crying about the death or the end of culture and tradition, they make fun of the death of culture and tradition. And in their literature, we have some terms such as nihilism or nihilism, and we have metafictions, which are very important in the postmodern age, and the last age, which is the postmodernism, which is the age that we are living in now. That's all for today. It's very thick and too much stuff mentioned here. But if you have any question, maybe we will have a Zoom in the future, and I will answer any of your questions. Just if you have any question, please write these questions down, and I'll be happy to answer your questions. Thank you very much, guys, and look at these exercises if they may help you understand some of the stuff here. Yeah, that's all. Thank you very much, and have a wonderful day.